It is 11 o'clock, and I want to welcome all of our distinguished speakers. Thank you all for participating in this, and I also want to thank everyone who's joining us online today for our Southwest Research and Outreach Center, University of Minnesota Southwest Research and Outreach Center Advancing Ag webinar series topic for today. We're going to be talking about edge of field practices and trying to achieve water quality goals. So that's our theme for today. This is an educational series that we started back in January of this year, actually, and we're trying to bring together a diverse group of experts like yourselves, along with the people who are actually online listening and watching us to address crop production, water quality, soil health types of matters. We've had 7 of these. This is the 7th one so far. They've all been quite successful from my perspective, and I hope the panel and the participants that are out there enjoy today's session. So for those people that are out there listening, you will have an opportunity to share some of your questions. If you've got questions, what you need to do is to submit your questions through the Zoom Q&A feature. That's going to be at the bottom of your screen. If you roll over it with your mouse, you can enter a question. Our faithful helper there, Emily, will get those questions. She will get them to me through our Google Doc, and then I will share them as it seems appropriate as we go through our questions and things for today. We've got 7 different speakers on with us today, and I am not going to waste any time. I'm going to go right to introductions. So each person has a couple of minutes to introduce yourselves and give a little highlight about what you're working on and how it fits within the Edge of Field Practices forum that we're having today. And Bill Crumpton, would you please start, Bill?
Let me get unmuted here. My name is Bill Crumpton, obviously. Excuse me. I'm a university professor at Iowa State University. I've been here, this is my 38th year. Been working on water quality for that entire time. For the past more than 30 years, focused on wetlands and agricultural landscapes, they're a primary edge of field practice for the nutrient strategy goals for the state of Iowa. So our work is focused on especially nitrogen and phosphorus performance of those systems, but also greenhouse gases, methylmercury, habitat.
Oh, that's absolutely perfect, Bill. Nice timing as well. Tyler, why don't you go next?
Thanks, Jeff. My name is Tyler Groh. I am a watershed management extension specialist for Penn State University. My background is in agricultural water quality, specifically in saturated buffers, wetlands, and I dabble a little bit in bioreactors as well in my master's. And currently working on agricultural water quality here within the Chesapeake Bay in Pennsylvania, specifically focusing on riparian buffers, combining really riparian buffer age with soil biogeochemistry and how that all integrates into water quality in shallow groundwater. Thank you so much for having me.
Excellent. Great introduction, Tyler. Tom, why don't you go next?
Good morning, Jeff. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. I'm Tom Christensen. I'm with Ecosystem Services Exchange, which is a limited liability corporation from Adair, Iowa. We're focused on providing technical services for the planning and implementation of principally water management conservation practices. So that would be controlled drainage, that would be saturated buffers, denitrifying bioreactors, and sub-irrigation. We're also a sister company of AgriDrain Corporation, which is a manufacturer of many of the water control structures and devices that some of you may be familiar with. And we're particularly focused on, obviously, producer adoption in a voluntary manner of conservation drainage practices. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tom. Gary, how about you?
So good morning, everyone. Thanks, Jeff. My name is Gary Feyereisen. I'm a research agricultural engineer with the USDA-ARS in St. Paul, Minnesota, in the Soil and Water Management Research Unit. Worked mostly in the area of drainage and reducing losses of nitrogen and phosphorus, and spent a lot of time in denitrifying bioreactors, which you may know as wood chip bioreactors. We've done quite a bit of work in the lab with other media, agricultural residues, for example, the hydraulics, nutrient removal, and the biological aspects of these devices. Especially we focused on cold performance because a lot of the work in bioreactors has been done in Iowa and Illinois. That's south of Minnesota, and it's colder here, and we've got other issues then. Carbon dosing is one of the interesting things that we've worked on, including with you, Jeff. Thanks.
Great, Gary. Thank you. How about Kelly?
Hi, I'm Kelly Nelson, agronomy professor in the Division of Plant Sciences at the University of Missouri Greenlee Research Center. We're about an hour from the Iowa and Illinois borders. I've been working on drainage water recycling systems since 2000 and controlled drainage systems since about 2009. So a lot of that's been focused on the crop responses to those water management systems. Thanks, Jeff.
Excellent. Thanks, Kelly. Joe, you're up next.
Thanks, Jeff. Joe Magner, professor in the Department of Bioproducts and Biosystems Engineering on the St. Paul campus. I've been working with two-stage ditches now for over 2 decades and trying to come up with the right combination of design to meet not only water quantity, but water quality needs. I'm also kind of working with soil health, and then also working with biochar as a product that can be used for water quality treatment as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Joe. Tim, you're up.
Hey, thanks, Jeff, for having me, and thanks for everybody for signing on. My name is Tim Youngquist. I'm in the agronomy department at Iowa State University, and I work on the Prairie Strips team. So I'm the farmer liaison for that group. I travel around Iowa and then just kind of the Midwest in general, helping farmers and landowners install and design and implement prairie strips on their land, and then helping the research team conduct research on those sites. And I farm corn and soybeans with my father in Northwest Iowa. So I've got a lot of practical ag experience and have implemented a lot of these practices on our farm. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. And Chris, last but not least, I know you're probably traveling there, so hopefully you can hear us. And why don't you introduce yourself, Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I'm driving in the car, so hopefully the connection's not too bad. But I'm a research professor with the University of Minnesota, the BB department, and also been working with Nature Conservancy on a variety of projects. And I'm here for Rich Biskey. He couldn't make it today. He had to take his son somewhere. But yeah, it's Nature Conservancy has been working on edge of field practices, for a number of years now. The TNC National Agriculture Group has recently created an edge of field roadmap, which is more focused on, I'd say, bigger picture kind of policies to try to scale up edge of field practices, especially ones that are low tech and have kind of multiple benefits, promoting ecosystem services and trying to connect other economic, I guess, incentives for doing edge of field practices. And TNC uses the term maybe more broadly than others here. I would say it includes two-stage ditches, saturated buffers, puddles, prairie strips, kind of everything that's not in the field, really. And I guess just to kind of wrap it up, most recently, the Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota chapter is working on its own edge of field strategy. And
Chris,
you started on
Chris, your audio is going in and out kind of badly on us. Well, technical difficulties while driving unexpectedly, having to step up and be on the panel. Hopefully we'll get Chris, can you hear me? Chris? Chris, your audio is pretty much kind of gone out, so we didn't really hear much of anything you said after the first minute.
To build on what the national group did.
Okay, maybe he'll be able to come back. I'm not sure. So we'll go ahead and proceed here. I want to put a few things in context, particularly as this is a University of Minnesota program. And this kind of drives me personally back to 2012, when the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency had come out with the Minnesota Nutrient Reduction Strategy. And I know for those of you that have worked in Iowa and out in places like Illinois and Indiana, also produced nutrient reduction strategy documents. And those documents were really, really wonderful, pulling a lot of information together from across the upper Midwest in terms of practices that included a lot of these edge of field practices that we've already heard some of you talk about today, in terms of looking at reductions of N and P. And those real important targets, at least that certainly Minnesota has, and I know Iowa has, I'm a little familiar with their report, is that we're striving for these 45% reductions in N and P from our waters. And so these are tools, among other tools, these edge of field practices. There are a couple of others that I know we've gotten a couple of questions about already in the Google Doc related to perennials, which we'll answer that question. And another one related to essentially residue cover, strip tillage. We're going to steer a little away from some of the fertility issues. That could be a whole nother session. But the idea today is to talk about some of these edge of field practices and answer people's questions. And I've got one that I'd like to sort of start us out at. And presuming that many of you are familiar with some of those reports, for Minnesota, our report indicated that we were maybe, if I don't have the numbers exactly right in my head, but toward that 45% reduction, the Minnesota report, I believe, said that we were, somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 30% toward achieving the phosphorus goal in terms of reduction. But we had really scarcely moved the needle on nitrogen at all. From the background data that they were assessing and then looking at the more current data, we hadn't really moved the needle much on nitrogen. So given some of your perspectives and things like that, and thinking about trying to achieve some of these, pretty important water quality goals, not only locally, but also then as we think beyond our borders of our states down to the Gulf of Mexico, for example, in the bigger watershed, in terms of the practices themselves, could anybody want to address what they might have seen in particular advances in the science toward meeting some of these goals with some of the edge of field practices that we already have? I guess, Gary, I'll kind of point you out to start with, if we can kind of get the ball rolling with you. And you and I have done some work related to bioreactors and carbon dosing in cold temperatures. And I would say that was some things that hadn't really been talked about a lot back in 2012. And maybe you might want to talk about some of those type of advances just briefly and some of what you might want to say.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. I thought you're going to talk, in terms of, I didn't know if you want to talk about putting things in perspective, like management changes, land use changes, edge of field.
We can take it wherever the group goes and wherever the questions go. So, answer the question, and then if you want to take it a little different direction, that's fine.
Well, I'll get to the answer, but I'm working with people from Iowa and Illinois on a paper right now where we're looking at the strategies and the ways to meet the 45% goal. And we've made some assumptions. In-field practices can only get us so far. Nitrogen management, for example, something like 10 or 12% reduction. Taking land out of, changing land use, putting it into perennials, cover crops is a big one. But there are practical barriers to all these things. And then the final group, which we're talking about today, is the edge of field practices. And actually our study is showing that the further you go into the reductions, the more the edge of field practices are going to have to play in it. They tend to be effective and efficient. They have different strengths and weaknesses, which will probably come out in this panel. But wetlands is a big one. Bioreactors is a big one. Saturated buffers where they can be put in is important. One of the things that's lacked with bioreactors, on the design side, we can only treat so much water. A lot of our water is coming in big storms now. And the bioreactor design is such that it can't treat everything. So in the big storms, there's going to be overflow. And so it's a balancing act between how much we can treat and how much we can't. And then the bigger problem, the further north you go, is that the colder the water is in the runoff period of April, May, and early June, when water temperatures are below 10 degrees C. And so we focused on that problem. It's basically a lack of carbon availability for the microbes at that point. The microbes that release carbon from the wood chips are actually affected more than the ones that do the denitrifying. So we found that if we can add readily available carbon, we can keep the denitrification rates quite high, actually. And there's two ways that have proven to be promising. One is to use corn cobs, actually, because the carbon is not as recalcitrant as it is in wood chips. The other way is to add a carbon source such as acetate. And that also, and we end up with some real high rates. There are practical problems to these, there are economic issues, but those are kind of the two approaches that we've been taking.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I like where you went with that, Gary. And I think one of the other things that among the group of the panel, I'll just make a comment here, because I wrote down two things that struck me when you were talking, Gary. Whenever we think about, for example, there's, as a soil scientist, I would say there's no replacement for good agronomic production practices, right? So we've got to start with good fertilizer management and those kinds of things in order to be able to look at some of these other practices down the road. We're going to make an assumption that we're doing good management practices for nutrients, for example. But no matter what we're going to think about and talk about, and people who've heard me talk and others in this group, I'm sure, would say that there are no silver bullets. No matter what we're going to do, there are going to be some trade-offs, some advantages, some disadvantages to the different things that we might select. Some may have less trade-offs than others, but there's going to be inevitable trade-offs. And then the other thing that jumped into my head, and I'm not sure if Bill's itching to say something or not there, but one of the things that also popped into my head, and it was based off of a conversation I had with one of our folks here in one of our state agencies in Minnesota, is thinking about these practices. And it really opened up my eyes a little bit more so I could see the forest through the trees, that we're really talking about not just those water quality benefits, but also those other ecosystem service things, right? So Bill and I have talked about habitat and some of these other types of things that might come along with some of these practices that we really should not be ignoring when we're thinking about these things. So, so anybody want to comment on some of the things that Gary had made a few references to there? If you do, you got to turn your microphones on. Okay, well that's good. So
I would not counter. I mean, the comments that Gary was making about seem right on to me. I'm interested in the results they're getting for the bioreactors. In the case of some of the other practices, I don't know. In the case of wetlands, the carbon limitation does not appear to be an issue in the spring periods. Most of our work on wetlands performance is based on actual field scale systems, which are subject to those temperatures. The temperature that's experienced by the microbes varies much more than you might expect if you consider it what's the temperature when the loads are actually occurring, right? So because we sometimes have really heavy spring loads, the temperatures are cooler. And then occasional years we will have low spring flows and much more load coming in the summer, and the temperatures are warmer. We can have a 10 degrees Celsius difference between the coolest and the warmest years, not average temperature for the year, but the average temperature weighted for the loads that are actually received day by day throughout the year. It's coming about the decomposers, mineralizing bacteria being more susceptible to temperature, responsive to temperature changes than denitrifiers. That's exactly what we would observe. The denitrification is limited more by transport, which is diffusion limited linear response, whereas for metabolism of organic carbon, that's really a metabolic limitation. So there's about a doubling per 10 degrees of Celsius in response. So yeah, the metabolic processes like mineralization are much more temperature sensitive.
So those are great comments, Bill. And it made me kind of think, Joe, I'm going to put you on the spot here since we're talking about carbon. And I'm wondering, are you aware of some of the two-stage ditch work? I know there's been some done in Minnesota here, some in Indiana and Ohio. That have they done any carbon work? Have they published any papers? Are you aware of any of the literature that would suggest that there's carbon benefits or carbon limitations to those two-stage ditches?
Yeah, we didn't really look at that in Minnesota, but Jen Tank down at Notre Dame, I would say she's probably one of the leading experts now on two-stage ditches, and they are looking at that whole carbon relationship. Again, she just came out with a publication here just about a year ago, and so I'd encourage you to kind of look at that in ecological engineering.
Yeah, that's a good point, Joe. I want to kind of take a little bit of what you said as I think about it and think about, these systems, right? That Gary starting off talking a little bit about bioreactors, and then Bill on wetlands, and you a little bit with these two-stage ditches. That regardless of those three systems and some of the other systems that we're going to talk about here as well as we get into them, is that when we think about these things, Bill, you made a really good point. In some cases, there might be some flow limitations because of diffusion, or it might be, a nutrient, like carbon, that might be some challenges that could be rate limiting for some of these processes. And so much of that could probably vary from year to year as we get weather variability that we have. The amount of flow here in Minnesota this year with our drought, we had very little drain flow, and water quality is not on people's minds this year. I want to jump to a question that somebody piped in, and it's a really good. It's more of a statement and then a question to it. So I'll just read it here. It says design guidance from NRCS basically does not recommend the use of bioreactors or saturated buffers on tile systems that have surface inlets. Right. We're very concerned about sediment basically in those systems is the main question there, or the main concern. And so it goes on to say producers are typically hesitant to remove these intakes. What do you think about installing these practices on tile systems that have alternative rock tile inlets? All right, so it implies that these surface inlets are going to be like a straight pipe, and the question is related to, could we use these bioreactors saturated buffers in systems that have intakes but are not straight pipes, but rather a rock inlet or some sort of an alternative inlet that has some filtration capacity, slows the water down, perhaps removes some of the sediment. So does anybody have any experience with those? Tyler, go right ahead.
Well, I have very limited experience. I was going to add the new 604 standard for saturated buffers that came out in January 2020 actually addresses this and actually loosens up that restriction. So it says if the inlet is protected from sedimentation and surface and like stover and stuff like that from getting into the pipe. So things that could protect the surface inlets are now required if there's a surface inlet system. You don't have to remove the surface inlet. It just has to be protected from that sedimentation. I can put a link to that new code in the chat if that's helpful for attendees.
Sure, it might be. Yep,
Okay.
that'd be great.
So, Jeff, I'd like to comment because I've had experience in the field with some rock inlets.
Absolutely, Gary, go ahead. This
Yeah.
is how the format is supposed to work.
Right, and I guess I have some opinions about it because I've seen some bioreactors that have been plugged by sediment also. And it's really careful. What is a rock inlet? I think maybe I'll put in the chat too. I've got a link to a paper we wrote with some folks in Indiana that if you put in gravel size rock, the sediment will still settle and come down to the tile. But we did work with a certain type of very fine gravel. I would call it a fine gravel, be larger than sand, but smaller than gravel, smaller than pea gravel, up in the Morris area, kind of west central Minnesota. That was very effective at taking like 90+% taking the sediment out. Something like that would be wise.
Well, Gary, so that was, I was going to press you a little bit because I was going to say, okay, gravel, are we talking, 3/4 of an inch, and then you got to the pea gravel size? So
Yeah,
I think
it's below that. It's in millimeters, 4 to 6 millimeters. So it's
okay. So it's large. It's larger than the largest sand size, basically.
Right, which is 2
2
millimeters.
Yeah.
Right. It's
so,
2. Yeah.
Go ahead, Gary.
No, I've seen something like the Hickenbottom structures will let silt. The problem is the silt that's in the water that ponds, for example, in a lowland and comes in with the water. When that gets into the bioreactor, eventually the velocity is too slow to carry it, and it will settle out around the inlet and build up over time.
Right.
So we're working on a cutoff system actually right now, but it's kind of impractical for smaller bioreactors. But on large systems, like Square Mile, for example, we're working on a shut. We actually have a successful shutoff system to keep the water out when it's turbid.
I want to jump back to Tyler real quick, and then Bill, I saw you were going to speak, so I'll jump back to you. But Tyler, I wonder, you brought up the 604 standard, and protecting seems a little bit nebulous to me, in terms of verbiage, right? So, when you said that, I was thinking, well, I hadn't thought about Gary's thoughts or comments related to, a smaller grain size in the bioreactor, which would definitely, as a soil physicist, slow the water down. So you might have ponding in your field longer than you'd like, which might be a detriment. I don't know what the research showed there, Gary, but, it also sort of suggested to me that perhaps, a person may have like a grass buffer around one of those, which, I live and work with farmers, and, that's not necessarily going to make them super happy because it's harder to farm around, right? So we've got some of these practicalities. So I'd say that, part of this would be, what's your thought, Tyler, as to what this protection might be other than, grass buffers? And maybe Tim, you might have some thoughts too, given some of the buffer work you've worked out. And Bill, I will get back to you.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and it is a little nebulous. I feel like there's a lot of language in that conservation practice standard that is like that because they're trying not to restrict everything everywhere. They're trying to make these practices more general and able to go in. As far as what will work, I don't know. That's a really good question. The whole buffer or critical portion, critical protection zone around the inland outlet or inland pipe is a very good idea, Jeff. I do realize that, producers, first of all, like land, is money. It's if you can't produce a crop there, you're losing out on money, as well as it is going to be harder to drive around, even if you make it, squared edges and try to make it as easy to plant around as possible. But yeah, I don't think there's a good answer that will solve every single field issue. But it will be definitely up to the people installing that practice to make sure that the sediment and corn silver and other surface runoff and particulates will not plug up the pipe. So it'll definitely have to be a situation by situation basis, I think.
I agree. As all good scientists, we're going to say, well, it depends, right? Tim, did you have anything you wanted to say? And then I'll let Bill follow up.
Yeah, thanks. So I don't know the numbers particularly, but one of the groups that we've worked with here in kind of north central Iowa, they've had good luck using kind of those like a silt sock that you see, you know, commonly more in like a highway construction or those kind of things, and using those to protect the inlets, and that slowing down the sediment pretty significantly. Then, you know, we're saying, well, everything is different from field to field. Yeah, it is. So, you know, you can't say, well, in every situation, you know, maybe having a grass buffer or something like a prairie buffer is going to add more time to it. You know, we've had situations where with the CP43, the CRP standard for prairie strips, if you have a terrace that has an inlet above the terrace, you might already have an area that the inlet is blobbed out into the field. Then by taking something like a prairie or a grass buffer, you can again make that like a uniform edge and add some efficiency to the field. So, you know, every situation isn't going to be the same, but in some of those areas where you have an inlet above a terrace, you can add some protection and then also potentially increase a little bit of efficiency by just adding a small amount of prairie kind of around that inlet area, and then filter a little bit more.
Having some smart design in place ahead of time sounds like a good idea. So Bill, sorry to put you off this long. Hopefully you didn't forget what you wanted to say.
It was a question.
Oh, go ahead.
And so it could be directed at, I don't want to put Tom on the spot here, but it's about a product AgriDrain had produced a few years back that was being tested for, it was these water quality inlet structures, preformed plastic structures that were intended to filter the water. I saw some early tests on that, but it's been a long time. I assume if they had really performed as expected, we'd have heard more about them, but I don't know. Does anyone have experience with a solution like that? And are they really appropriate for the kind of silt that Gary, I think it was Gary was talking about, maybe it was Joe.
Bill, this is Tom. I can't say that I'm familiar with that, but I can certainly follow up with Charlie Schaefer and get back to you all or through Jeff on that.
Yeah, and Bill, I have the similar recollection as you, but I haven't really seen anything that kind of came out of that. So I don't have an answer myself. Anybody else?
Yeah, I think somebody, maybe Illinois, maybe Richard Cook or somebody in Illinois has looked at it, but I don't know, Bill, if a paper came out of that, not sure.
Okay, for some of the people who deal with this, it might be interesting to find out. There was some early work that looked kind of promising, but then it's not my area of research, so I haven't followed it. But on the AgriDrain website, if those had proved out, I suspect there'd be much more about that function. It seems to be mainly about keeping debris out of the tile on the website. So
yeah, and I would argue that the question specifically was looking at or focused toward that I read before from that the person gave was related to bioreactors and saturated buffers. In some of the ditch work that we do here at Lamberton, we're not using a two-stage system. We're using a low-grade weir, and sediment is also a concern for us in our ditch system in terms of management and having to have added expense. So we're always concerned about sediment, and that kind of brings me to this other question, which it's not an edge of field necessarily practice, but I think it sort of tailors in a little bit to the sediment question. And the question was, why isn't strip till being promoted more widely as a water quality improvement strategy? I know that from a strategy that we use here at the research center, we have some long-term strip till plots in our tillage trial. And we really haven't used those for water quality measurements. We're more interested in trying to make sure that corn grows when it's cold. It's harder for us to do no-till for corn. And so strip till is a bit of an option that some growers have and have used here in Minnesota. But at least from my perspective, and I'm not familiar with all of that tillage research, but it's not one that we've done or that I'm familiar with. That there's been a lot done from our part of the world. I don't know, Kelly, are you aware of anything that might be like in that neighborhood?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't done anything specifically on strip till. I would say you guys have led the way. But specifically when it comes to water quality, I mean, it makes sense when you're enhancing fertilizer use efficiency and stand establishment that there would be a benefit there. But yeah.
And I think, Kelly, that extra, the extra residue is going to help some of that sediment runoff as well from raindrop impacts too. So there might be some added benefit there.
Yeah, when it comes to surface water runoff, I think there's tremendous because there's a tremendous benefit because we're only tilling about 30% of that soil. So we're still maintaining a significant amount of cover. So yeah, for surface water issues, I think there's a real benefit there. Again, when it comes to fertilizer use efficiency as part of a 4R management approach, I think there would be also a benefit from that perspective as well.
Mm-hmm.
So so if you're promoting strip till, you're promoting no-till. I mean, a modified version of no-till, right? So when we see reports on the prevalence of no-till, how many of those are actually strip till?
If that's a question to one of the panelists, Kelly, you could maybe answer it. I have no idea, but I do know that when we do strip till on our plots here at the research center, you could argue, Bill, to some degree that you're absolutely right, because in order for us to make that work pretty well, even in our no-till, we have to have the trash whippers set pretty well to move that residue out of that planting row for our no-till to work pretty effectively here in southern Minnesota. So, I can't answer the question, but it's a good point.
I would say on our strip till work, it's been, you have something, usually a trash cleaner to move the residue apart. I mean, it's not as aggressive as a strip till unit. So I'd say we're more of a purist when it comes to that strip till versus no-till comparison. And, a lot of that comes back to nitrogen sources and, what we're utilizing for as part of that system. So placement is a big deal when it comes to strip till. And so, the strip till is actually strip till versus an actual no-till system.
So Kelly, I want to follow up a little bit and say that one of the things that I kind of wonder about is I visit with farmers in our area that do some strip till and no-till, and the question always ends up coming back to me. And we do fall strip till. I don't know what you folks have done down there, but we get these questions, and it's well, do we do fall strip till? Do we do spring strip till? Here in Minnesota, the fall strip till works pretty good because generally it tends to be drier, and when we get these colder, wetter springs, it's going to make that seed bed not the most ideal place if we're trying to do strip till in the spring when we've got wet, heavy soils that are doing that are going to actually kind of muck things up, if you will. So I'm wondering, do you guys have some pattern down there? I mean, you're quite a bit south of us down there in that northeast Missouri area, but do you find that people use both or one or the other?
I'd say the preference would be a fall as well. It kind of depends on how you equip that with a rolling basket to help crumble that. I mean, we have had some successful systems that you can strip till in the spring, but typically it would be in the fall. Yeah.
Do you guys have a lot of wind? Because living 5 minutes from my office, I will tell you that we do our fall strip till, and then in the spring when I go back out to look at the plots, it doesn't look like we've done any tillage at all, because in Minnesota the wind blows just a little bit, and it blows a lot of residue back on top of those, and we got to move the trash off. Of course, you've got that 8-9 inch row that's been tilled ready, but do you guys see that down there?
Not particularly. I
Okay.
would say, I mean, even with anhydrous applications alone, you can still see those.
Okay. Okay, the question was, why isn't strip till being promoted more widely? It sounds kind of clear from our conversation. We don't have a direct answer as to why it's not being promoted more widely, but it sounds that we have a little bit of a consensus that there are some definite benefits in terms of water quality, sediment runoff, nutrient efficiencies that would be a good reason to be able to use strip till if it can be part of your program.
Right. Jeff,
yeah.
if I could just mention, getting back to the question, maybe this is the wrong group of people to ask.
Well, I hear you.
But-
But I don't want to disenchant the
No.
people who are listening and have these questions. And so,
Right. No, but I was just going
Go
to
ahead.
add something anecdotally because I haven't done any tillage research myself, but we are currently working in Faribault County, which is right in south central Minnesota on the Iowa border. And there are several strip tillers right in. We've got a couple of small watersheds about a square mile. And anecdotally, we see differences in infiltration, for example, and they put cover crops. These are some of the farmers that have gone through Minnesota's program for water quality, and their soils are softer. The technician tells me I got to be careful when I'm driving out there in the spring. And we're just starting. We've got a few years of monitoring, so it takes a long time, but we've got paired watersheds. And I suspect we're going to see some measurable differences in losses. In one watershed in particular, the guy's been strip tilling for 15 years. And
Wow.
So far, the concentrations look like they're lower and the loads are lower. But so I think whoever asked the question is really on the right track.
well, and Gary, I'll follow up quick, and then Bill, I see your hand is up. I'll follow up and say that when we talked a little bit earlier about that, the NRCS guidance related to bioreactors, saturated buffers, and I would argue even the ditch work that we're doing, or a wetland as well, that sediment is I don't want to call sediment the enemy, but we really want to keep the soil in place where it's at. And so, doing practices that can minimize that off-site movement of the soil off of where it currently resides, it would be always a really, really good thing. Bill, you had your hand up, and then we're getting some other really good questions here. So I don't want to lose any of them.
Yeah, so I understand we want to answer the questions as they're posed, but I want to hear, there are a lot of experts on here about edge of field practices that I don't work on. And I would like to see us get back to some edge of field questions.
Yeah, no. I mean, the other,
asking these questions. So
yep. The other thing that I'll point out is this is the first year we've done this, and it was an artifact of COVID in that we weren't able to meet with a lot of our clientele face to face. And so it's questions like these that we get that really helped us as a group of scientists come up with our next panel that we have. Maybe we're going to have something that we'll have to have related to tillage. And I would also ask everyone who's listening that when you have the opportunities to put in comments or fill out the at the end of the session, Emily will be putting in a link to be able to review the session today. That if you have comments about other topics that you'd like us to cover and have a panel, please, put those in there so we can do that. I've got one here that I like this one a lot. This is on saturated buffers, and I think this is a great question. Dan James has talked a bit about this. So the question is a statement and then the question. Occasionally, a landowner is interested in a saturated buffer along a drainage ditch. Many of the drainage ditches in southern Minnesota are deep with steep side slopes, 2 to 1, okay? Are there concerns about saturating the ditch bank and causing sloughing? So can somebody address, and I know we have some experts here, any thoughts on when this can be done or how to avoid problems with ditch bank stability? Now, I know that we can have our expertise on ditches or saturated buffer speak here in a second, but I know Dan James has talked about this in the past, that you know, if you've got a landscape that's too flat, it might not be a good place for a saturated buffer. So go ahead, take it away.
Well, I would just add, Jeff, that, you know, the pore pressure that's put on some of these ditches is gonna cause some slumping. It's typically gonna be kind of it won't be a rotational slump. It'll just be, you know, the whole thing will just have too much pore pressure and it'll slide down. I mean, this is right. And I mean, this is already happening without kind of creating a saturated buffer out there. What we see throughout southern Minnesota and Iowa, and that is that just naturally these really steep slope ditches are forming natural benches. We wrote a paper about this a decade ago now, that if you just sort of leave it alone, eventually you'll start to form some little benches inside these ditch geometries, just because there's enough pore pressure that's pushing through these cohesive soils that these things are sliding down. So that if you enhance that with a saturated buffer, for sure they're gonna break.
Yep, I would tend to agree. I think, you know, Satish Gupta had done a lot of work on the Minnesota River and the valley. And I don't know, Tyler, you probably have some comments about the saturated buffers there.
Yeah, so I feel like, once again, say it's situational. Like you said, with everything is that we're talking about. So the actual, 604 code said no bank over 8 feet tall unless it can be proven that it's a stable bank. And that they said can rely on even local knowledge, like your local county conservation district, and realizing if it is a stable or, moving bank. You can tell that by seeing if it is truly vegetated and if it doesn't have any erosion, especially within the last 5 years. That's the true test. I will say anecdotally again that we did install a saturated buffer on a very, very tall 15 plus feet drainage ditch in northwestern Iowa. I'm not sure what the current status is, but at least 2 years after when it was installed, there hasn't been any increased visual slumping in that site. But that's not to say that, it won't happen over time, or that, we're out of the woods. There's also was a paper by the civil engineering department at Iowa State that modeled the slope stability and nature of these systems. And they found that saturating really didn't decrease slope stability and therefore had limited amount of erosion potential. But once again, that's not to say that, it's not going to eventually happen in situations where you maybe have looser soil, or you have a fast meandering stream that, maybe puts a little bit more pressure against the stream bank that kind of erodes it out. So it really is situational. The number one key is to make sure you understand your stream and to see if it is in that category of moving and shifting, and eroding out.
Yeah, Tyler, I liked what you said there. I've got just a quick comment, then we'll move to our next question. We've got a couple more here but I think about Minnesota, and I think about, one area when we started talking about saturated buffers here, that I know that down in the far, far western border of Minnesota and Iowa, we've got some areas where there's a shallow loess cap, so 12 inches of these wind-blown sediments underlain by some sands and gravels. And people ask me about, well, would we be able to do a saturated buffer there? And I get quite nervous on those sands and gravels as, being too unconsolidated and could have a slumping kind of a problem in something like that. So in looking at time, you guys are not going to believe we've only got 10 minutes left. This time is flying by. So I've got two other questions that are in the Google Doc right now. I'll do the first one. This one is from apparently somebody that has some sensitivity toward the SWCDs and their challenges, and I totally get this. The other one is about water retention on the landscape and wetlands. So we'll do that one next. So the first thing is again, sort of a little preface here. It says, as an SWCD, we know where a lot of these practices need to be implemented, and we provide the cost share. However, a lot of our programs are voluntary. So getting landowners to participate is always a challenge. What are ways you would recommend being able to convince landowners to become involved in these BMPs? So I'm going to take a very quick stab at this, and it's a very general comment. But one of the things that I'm going to use to address that question with non-specific language is that sometimes when I work with growers around here with some of the practices that we use, if I talked about the fact that Bill's been doing all kinds of really great work down in Iowa for years, and he's in the Des Moines lobe, we're in the Des Moines lobe, I'm trying to connect all the dots, people are still going to say, well, but it's not in my backyard, right? So, you know, it's one of these things where, you know, sometimes it's people are a little bit shy of saying, well, prove it to me here, you know, under our conditions, even though, you know, I was not that far away. We got similar soil types. The glacier created the same situation. So, you know, I understand where they're coming from. And I guess some of it is up to us as researchers, you know, those of us that are in our respective states to do the best that we can to be able to provide good research data to support whether these practices are working or not, and then get some of these outreach activities like we're trying to do today into the minds of the people that are out there, and also to try to work with some of those progressive growers out there that are willing to try early adoption. And then once their neighbors see what they're doing, then, you know, they may have the inclination to try to, you know, take some of those things on to adopt them as well. So those are just my quick thoughts. And anybody else got comments?
Jeff, this is Tom. I'd like to comment on that. So what you just stated about the leading producers actually reminds me of an effort that was called Finding Elmer in North Dakota in the 1950s, and was basically the same concept. Who are your leading producers, your adopters, and how can you employ them to help lead the way for other producers? So I think it's still obviously a hugely valid concept, hugely important to conservation practice adoption. I might also approach it in another way, and that's this suite of barriers to the adoption of these conservation drainage practices. And we know there's a host of barriers out there. We just did a little work with the Conservation Drainage Network, which is basically researchers, practitioners, not so much producers. That's an area we need to do more work on. But we found identification of a number of key barriers to adoption. One of those is concerns about retrofitting existing systems and making it all work and the expense of that. So that's one challenge. Another challenge is if you're talking about controlled drainage, the physical labor, the manual labor involved in managing the water control structures at the right time of the year to get the right kind of impacts. There's also identification of sustained educational efforts. There's more of that needed, was pointed out as one of the key barriers. And then financial assistance. You know, there's EQIP, there are state programs. The problem is that most of these are pretty cumbersome for a producer. And you have to compete, you have to wait sometimes from the plan to implementation. And we actually have a project in Minnesota with NRCS in 41 counties in southeastern Minnesota, where we have a cooperative agreement and ESC is doing what we call a turnkey job. So instead of going to the traditional EQIP approach, we're doing the site investigation, we're doing the plan, we're doing the design, and we're moving right to implementation. Money doesn't ever have to change hands on the part of the producer. We're paying the contractor with NRCS funds and a little bit of contribution from ESC. So the bottom line there is we really have to overcome the cost sharing barriers that are significant and make it very cumbersome for producers to actually implement these practices. And one more point I'll make, controlled drainage. We've been at this for at least a couple of decades. The amount of adoption under the Environmental Qualities Incentives Program, which is a large-scale cost sharing program, is only 105,000 acres in the last 12 years. That alone should tell us there are significant barriers we have to overcome if we're going to get producers to adopt these practices and then get the true benefits, the water quality benefits, the potential yield benefits, the wildlife benefits, the flood control benefits, et cetera. So good question, because there are some significant barriers to overcome.
Yeah, there's there's always challenges. I know when Kelly and I, we started doing some of our drainage water recycling work, the one producer that we worked with, it took almost 24 months to get things pushed through all of the right channels. And I think, Kelly, it might have taken you a little bit longer, if I remember correctly. So, you know, these things take time, and it's unfortunate that we can't get them on the ground faster. But again, there are some trade-offs and limitations to things that sometimes are beyond our control. This other question here, this one was going back to sediment in the Minnesota River Basin, and a lot of sediment coming from bank and bluff erosion down into the valleys and from the tailplains into the valleys, and indicating that slowing the water release from the tailplane is a primary solution. So the question is there a thought of combining the functions of constructed wetlands for denitrification with the need for water retention? Bill, this one's right up your alley.
Yeah, so I see Les submitted that, and I know he's given a lot of thought to this issue. We have an, am I muted? Sorry, no, I'm not.
No, you're good. You're good.
This comes up a lot in Iowa, and he's asked a slightly different question than typically comes up. Typically, we're asking wetlands to reduce flooding, and there is virtually no chance that the kind of wetlands we're talking about as an edge of field water quality practice can significantly influence flood events. We were asked years back to design the Iowa crepe wetlands to hold a 100-year flood for 72 hours. That would have required us stacking 40 feet of water on a wetland that's only 1.5 feet deep. So it's the scale of the flooding. Now, when it comes to sediment loads, not only sediment, but a lot of the phosphorus loads on the main stems, not just of larger rivers, but Huck 12 scale rivers. By the time you get to 10,000, 15, 20,000 acres on the Des Moines lobe of Iowa, the sediment and phosphorus loads there are primarily 5, 6, 7 days during the year carry 90% of the load, and it's during those high flow periods with a lot of stream power where you get that bed and bank erosion. Those are periods when the flows coming through those wetlands are so high, we can impact hydrology of streams at low and moderate flows, but you can't in practice impact them during those peak events. Not significantly. You can impact them barely a measurable amount. And I've seen reports out of some hydrology groups, even here in Iowa, that report a 10% or better reduction in peak flows. They refer to them as flood flows, but in practice, they're not talking about flood flows. They're talking about every little event. So you might have a dozen, 15, 20 events during a year. Every time we get a little bit of a rise, that's an event. So yeah, you can get a 10% reduction of the small flows, but not the large ones that both flood and cause that massive bed and bank erosion that Les was referring to.
So basically what you're saying, Bill, is the size matters.
And the matters, and not that size matters. Maybe, I'm not sure what you mean by that, but when you get to a certain scale, when you get a large event, large events drive bed and bank erosion. And large events, how do you contain a large event? It's not clear so far that there's a practical way to avoid that. It may be that allowing streams to we channelize a lot of streams on the Des Moines lobe of Iowa. Allowing those streams to reestablish natural patterns might reduce the power. I don't know that there's an edge of field practice solution for this problem. Right?
And that's going to take us up to our hour, and I'm gonna want to do a few little housekeeping things here as we're going to start wrapping up. I do want to answer. There was a question that we had written early on. It was about would it be possible to make it legal to plant Kernza on buffer strips with and harvest it without using fertilizer? This was a short conversation that Bill and I had a little bit before the session started today, and some of it kind of comes back to that whole idea of what's the purpose of it really at the end of the day. So if the purpose is supposed to be for the ecosystem services of the water transmission and infiltration and habitat, then it might not be allowed to be able to plant the Kernza on there. But some of it depends on what the intent of the law and what the law actually says. So Tim, you may want to pipe in here really quick, but I don't know what the Minnesota buffer law says, if it says that you are not allowed to harvest those or not. So I'm a renegade. I'm a rebel, and I look at it and say, if we can improve water quality, and if we can find ways to get management to happen that allows farmers to farm, allows the environment to be at a high level of water and nutrient reductions, and the farmers are farming and making money, so there's an economic component to it, then let's let them do that. And that might mean allowing them to go in and do some of these harvesting activities. So Tim, do you have any real quick comment on any of that?
Yeah, I'd say go for it. I mean, we've had some kind of similar instances where prairie strip farmers are talked about, potentially planting like a strip of the prairie flowers and then having cover crop or something, on either side of that to kind of buffer from spray drift or tillage drift, whatever. But it wouldn't be something that you'd be able to get USDA cost share for, at least.
Right.
You have to have blooming.
And I see Tim Dries had just put a little comment in our chat for the Minnesota people that we are allowed to harvest those. So thank you for that, Tim, as well. So I'm going to wrap us up, everybody. I want to be respectful of everybody's time that agreed to participate today, as well as all the participants who might be wanting to head out and go to lunch. So first of all, thank you, all of you, so much for joining this. We had a large group. There was some trepidation as to how well this would work. I think everybody got a chance to talk and speak. I'm greatly appreciative of the time and your expertise today.